Sure.
Would you prefer to wait for Felipe to have more?
No, let's just go ahead because
Okay.
it's almost 6:30.
Okay.
So I'm going to be recording this presentation.
Okay.
Okay. There you are.
Okay. So I'm going to be.
What is your first impression about this article?
The article, it's so when I read it, it seemed like it encompassed like a lot of different topics, of many different topics. It went from the history, then it analyzed the history and the many different advantages of each kind of type of study, and then it went to analyze the future directions, as it says in the title, the future directions of SLA research. And the author seems to be like very like aware of all the different directions that this kind of research can take, and it's like very like that she knows what she's talking about, like
very knowledgeable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and she takes into account all the different kinds of research, so she's not like stuck with the one single type of research. So she's not with, she takes like the silver linings of every kind of research she finds. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so the title is Looking Ahead, Future Directions in and Future Research into Second Language Acquisition by Diane Larsen Freeman. And it's an article that first appeared in Foreign Language Annals in February 2018. And Alicia Arango will be presenting. Diane Larsen Freeman is a professor emerita at University of Michigan and a visiting senior fellow on educational linguistics in University of Pennsylvania. These are the topics that I'm going to be discussing. The history of the field. She makes reference to cognitivism, the social challenge, and the socio-cognitive process. Then other topics that she makes reference to are the zeitgeist. That was a term that I have to find in the internet because it was the first time that I saw it. And future SLA. She makes reference to an ecological orientation and the importance of context. And then other topics that she also includes in the paper are the monolingual bias, the separation of languages, the standard language dialect ideology, the teleology ideology, implications of SLA research and theory, and finally some conclusions. First of all, she makes reference to the contributions of these three men in here: Noam Chomsky with his universal grammar, Pete Corder with the existence of a built-in learner syllabus, and Larry Selinker, who stated that there was an interlanguage, so a language that was in between the target language and the native language of the learner, and which the learner used to communicate in the learning phase. So with these contributions, the cognitive era began, and it was like a revolution in linguistics. So the cognitivism was a revolution in that period for many different fields of research like linguistics, psychology, and other disciplines. and of course, SLA. There were reports of acquisition orders that appeared to be impervious to native language influence. And this was considered revolutionary because language teaching had just been in the embrace of behaviorism that took into account positive and negative transfer from the native language as the sole influence or the sole kind of influence that should be evaluated in the language acquisition process. Krashen hypothesized that there existed a natural order of acquisition. However, there were warnings to the contrary, such as reports of greater variability than universality. During this time, much attention in SLA was given, and now is still given, to the application of the universal grammar to second language acquisition, with form-focused instruction, task-based language teaching, input processing, output production, noticing, and the interface between explicit and implicit knowledge. Now we have the second era in the SLA research. Hines in 1972 stated that competence was made up not only of grammatical knowledge, but also of social knowledge, knowing how to use utterances appropriately. From this point on, subsequent research had a more functional view of language, with focus on the acquisition of illocutionary acts, requesting and apologizing, and the structure of conversation. And in the year 1987, Ruth and Wagner published a very important article that was a very challenging one, considering the research that had been that was being conducted at the moment, that stated that SLA process is essentially a social one. This article, Ruth Wagner, was actually presented here in class, and it's that one that I have the note here at the bottom. Second foreign language learning as a social accomplishment. Elaborations on a reconceptualized SLA. So since the turn of the 21st century, social approaches have flourished. Linguistic anthropology, sociocultural theory, conversation analysis, and language socialization. And in there we have some examples of these, of some articles on that matter. And the third type of research that was conducted was the socio-cognitive one. The socio-cognitive process was intended to find a balance between cognitive involvement and social interaction. In here, as an example, we find articles by Atkinson, like the one that was discussed in here, that towards a socio-cognitive approach to second language acquisition, in which she tries to find that balance. He tries to find the balance between the social component and the cognitive component. The learners have to be involved in a process, have to be studied as part of a process and not merely as subjects of research, and not as people that separated from the process itself. Complex dynamic system theory argues that language development occurs at the nexus or intersection of the two, so the social approach and the cognitive approach. Other theories in the field include usage-based linguistics, cognitive linguistics, cognitionism, and systemic functional linguistics. These theories view language as a dynamic system that is constantly being transformed through use. Unlike cognitive approaches, sociocognitive approaches favor patterns over rules as the object of learning. Unlike some of the social approaches before them, sociocognitive approaches blur the boundary between language use and its acquisition. These theories view language as a dynamic system that is constantly being transformed through use. Unlike cognitive approaches, sociocognitive approaches favor patterns over rules as the object of learning. And like some, this is repeated, I think, this last paragraph.
Yes.
And they blur the boundary between language's use and its acquisition. Yeah, I repeated that one. Sorry about that. The zeitgeist. The zeitgeist, I understood it as like the intellectual or mental feeling of the era. And this author says that it is characterized as rapid change and turmoil, with natural and political threats or social injustices, and that amidst the increasing complexities of language use in a global society, it is clear that simple answers to the question, how does one teach a language, or who are learners, will not be forthcoming. Seeking answers in SLA research amidst such complexity will require a new model of thinking. Now the author starts to make reference to what future SLA research should be focused on, directed to. First of all, she makes reference to the ecological orientation. Ecological theories are systems theories because systems consist of interconnected components. A change in any internal or external component of the developing system affects the others, often in unanticipated nonlinear ways. Example, individual differences, such as aptitude, age, attitude, and motivation, willingness to communicate, learner anxiety, identity, emotions, beliefs, and learning strategies. Those last 6 elements are like the new elements that have been added to the list. But in total, more than 100 dimensions in which learners differ have been identified. So the system is much more complex than what has been studied so far. There is a lot that needs to be taken into account to study SLA, to study second language acquisition. This is a quote that I took directly from the text because I think that it summarizes like the point that she tries to make here. Focusing on individual learners in context redirects research to a more person-centered frame of reference, which I expect to herald a new phase in SLA research that addresses what language learning affords for the transformation of self. Languages are not only acquired or learned, but lived. The learner is not merely a combination of variables. She also makes reference to the importance of context, and there is a C, it's not supposed to be there. The socio-political context and that of the nature of constraints that shape any particular acquisition context. So any instance in which a person is learning a language nowadays is going to be influenced somehow by that social political context in which the classroom or the event of learning is taking place. Language learning does not occur in an ideological vacuum, but rather is affected in a serious way by prevailing beliefs held by others, including the general public. let's say, including teachers' beliefs, including the beliefs of each one of the students inside of the classroom, including the general political ambience that you can have at that moment in the country or in the area. The monolingual bias is another important element. The one nation, one language equation may never have applied and certainly can no longer be considered true in many countries, since many people grow up with two or more languages, at least one language is used in the environment, and one language, and one the language of the home. Or they use multiple languages for a variety of purposes, and some people lead transnational lives. People that need to learn another language for work purposes, or because they travel a lot, or because they have families from living in other countries, etc. A primary purpose for teaching foreign languages is for students to confront their own monolingual biases and to understand the many pragmatic and humanitarian benefits of language learning. The separation of languages is another element here. There is a suggestion that languages themselves are individuated. Much research has shown that languages do not occupy separate regions of the brain. Furthermore, the influence of one language on another is bidirectional. So when a student is learning, there is the limits of each one of the languages blurs, and they could be taking elements from its own native language to make the learning of the second language easier, and vice versa. When they start to learn that second language, they can take elements back to the native language and start including it in the normal speech. And translanguaging, a version of code switching, is now recognized to be a widespread social practice of language use. The standard language dialect ideology. So there is a common belief that one version of the language or the dialect is superior to others. And usually it's believed that the one that is superior is the one spoken by educated native speakers. Such perceptions privilege, there is a mistake there, such perceptions privilege the standard language of the elites and instills language insecurity. Of course, if a part of the population believes that they are speaking what should be considered a superior kind of language, is going to make the rest of the population speaking that language feel insecurity. And it happens when students are learning languages. In addition, it may undermine the identities that our students have adopted in their native language. It is a fact that which language or dialect is designated as standard is a social, historical, political act, not a linguistic one. And this part is related to the article that's here at the bottom, Teaching Foreign Languages in an Era of Globalization by Crouch. Was presented by Felipe here. Finally, the last part of the paper deals with the implications of SLA research and theory. The implications for language assessment are that it's important to recognize, it is important to recognize not only language proficiency, but also interactional skills. The author hopes for a time when formative language testing is self-referential. So this means that the The student is going to be assessed according to what he was able to do, and I don't know, 2 months ago or 1 year ago, or at the beginning of the course. So the student itself is going to be taken, should be taken as a reference to measure the progress that he could have accomplished in that time. It could be highly useful if we could abandon the notion of static competence and opt instead for developing capacity, the ability to create in another language, not merely conform. The implications for research. So one significant area of future research is likely to come from investigating the role of context, which includes others in the social environment in contributing to and detracting from language learning success. For too long, researchers have been operating under the assumption that group averages reveal something about the population on which they are based. In truth, they do not. As a result, emphasis must be placed on the individual learner person. Implications for language teaching. While there is a variety of goals and programs and different types of learners, resource constraints mandate that most institutions that focus on classroom-based learning have a one-size-fits-all approach to language teaching. So in one single classroom, you can find students with many different backgrounds, learning goals, or proficiency levels. And all those students are going to receive the same program, the same class. They are all in the same place receiving the same class, when it shouldn't be like that. Of course, the constraints don't allow that it could happen some other way. But the author makes emphasis on the fact that it's important to exploit diversity and to focus on the particularities of each student rather than in that general all-encompassing approach. In this part, we can relate this part of the research to Ortega, to the article or to one of the chapters in Ortega's book from 2007, Understanding Second Language Acquisition, in which she addresses affect and other individual differences. Implications for language teaching. First, technology. Much language education is still based on a century-old model. Meanwhile, the reality is that people of all ages, and especially the mobile young, are managing to communicate across cultures and languages because they want to and need to, making use of prior knowledge, language acquired online or through the media and electronic translation tools. So technology today is everywhere. All people of all ages use it in many different ways for many different purposes. So it's very common that so to find that people are learning, are including new words in their repertoire, in their vocabulary, from things that they see online. They pick up words, they pick up expressions that include in their vocabulary. And they manage to communicate through, I don't know, playing video games from one country to the other and things like that. Adaptation. We need to teach our students not only to learn language, but also to mold their language resources, to prepare them for lives and for work that we cannot imagine, and for opportunities that do not yet exist. So as the world is evolving, technology is evolving, new types of job, new types of situations are going to be created in which language is going to, in which we're going to need to use language. and we're going to be able, and we need to be able to teach our students ways in which they can adapt and they can use what they know and adapt it to the new contexts. Affordances. A language policy that endorses and funds bilingual education affords the possibility for students to become bilingual. The second order, so because the author says that affording language learning has two levels. The first one is the existence of policies or mechanisms that could enable the student to receive that education, bilingual education. And the second one is that once the opportunities are created, once these scenarios are created, that the student takes advantage of it. And that depends on the attitude and some other factors that may be related to time or economical reasons, etc. Cultural reasons also, etc. And accessibility. And in here she makes reference to students with learning disabilities that are usually not included in second language learning programs because it is assumed that they are not going to be able to follow the program. And students from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds that, of course, don't have they cannot access all the opportunities that are out there as in the same way in which the students that have certain economical development can get to. Like, for example, I have a student of my own. She's a teenager and she's in a French school. So she's from Chile and she's in a French school. So she French is used as much as Spanish to in some subjects, and she's learning English also. So she has access to all these possibilities, and she wants to learn other languages after she finishes with English, and she has the opportunity to do so. She has the economical advantage to do so, but that's not what happens with everybody in the same country or in the same region with the same age. So there are many factors that affect the accessibility. And finally, the conclusions. Researchers need to look into ever-changing relationships among the components within the language learners' development system, which define and transform the learners, or should I say the persons, so path. So the author here makes, so when she says, or should I say the persons, she tries to make it more personalized, more specific to each one, and not only take into account the characteristic of that individual in the classroom, but like the cultural background and the socioeconomic background that that person could have. So humanize the learner. There is a need to address issues of social injustice by challenging the power imbalances in the world concerning the distribution of and access to language resources. Part of knowing about the world is knowing about the power dynamics and inequalities that revolve around access to and use of other languages, dialects in different contexts, for different purposes. Language teachers' effectiveness is limited without exercising this responsibility. So it's important that teachers are aware of the importance of addressing these kind of inequalities, of taking into account this kind of inequalities at the time of teaching and the time of implementing the new policies or new ways of teaching in the classroom. Using another language in a culturally sensitive and appropriate manner is indispensable for attending to many of the world's problems and in taking advantage of some of the benefits that multilingualism bestows in our modern world. So that would be it. This is the bibliography. It's much more longer than this, but these are from the quotes that are used in the presentation. That would be all.
Okay, Alicia. I was going to ask you, what is the contribution of this article for this course that we're taking called Theories of Second Language Acquisition? Does it make a contribution? Does it open new doors? How, in what respect is it different from what we have been reading so far?
Yeah, of course. I think that mainly the author makes emphasis on the fact that there are so many elements that have not been explored yet in second language acquisition research, that the learner is so much more than what has been considered so far. So that there are much more to it, that there is much more to it than what has been done until this moment, and that there are many individual particular elements to each person that need to be addressed, and that it's important that they are addressed because language needs to be seen as something that develops as a tool to develop the person itself, and not as the skill that needs to be mastered for other purposes. It needs to be like a way of developing the person using the resources that the person has to learn, and not imposing models or policies. I think that's a contribution.
So the new concept that is introduced here is the ecological, right? And it seems to me that that is the door that is being opened with these papers that we are reviewing in this part of the course, because we saw behaviorism, we saw cognitivism, connectionism, socio-cultural theory, socio-cognitive theories, individual differences, but they were seen isolated, and it seems to be that these views are more holistic in that they try to encompass all variables in a globalized and an interconnected world. That's why the other concept that is introduced here is the concept of translanguaging.
Yeah. So the ecological approach that says like all these little elements as being part of one single system interacting, and that everything has the same importance, and because if one single element fails, then that affects the whole system. So every little detail that needs to be taken into account is important and has relevance in SLA research.
Yeah, good.